The quiet hum of Harper's Diner blended with the clinking of plates and murmured conversations. Sophie Carter wiped the counter with practiced ease, her movements brisk but tired. She had been working double shifts for weeks, her paycheck barely stretching far enough to cover rent and groceries. Despite her exhaustion, Sophie maintained a warm demeanor, her soft brown eyes always ready with a smile for the regulars. Every evening, as she ended her shift, Sophie noticed the same elderly man sitting outside the diner. He was bundled in a worn coat, its fraying edges barely enough to stave off the biting chill of Willow Creek's late autumn. His name, she had learned from a passing conversation, was Henry. He spoke little, his weathered face etched with a lifetime of hardship. On most days, Henry sat quietly, gazing out at the world with an expression of resigned sorrow. Sophie's heart ached every time she saw him. She knew the cold was merciless and the hunger even more so. She didn't have much herself, often skipping meals just to make her money stretch, but the sight of Henry made her own struggles seem small. Thanksgiving was approaching, and Sophie had managed to save $90, just enough to buy herself a modest meal, and maybe a small treat. As she walked out of the diner that night, she saw Henry huddled against the wall, his frail hands trembling as he clutched his thin coat tighter. The sight stopped her in her tracks. Her thoughts wrestled with practicality and compassion. That money was meant for her, a small comfort in a life filled with sacrifice. But as she glanced at Henry again, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. "He needs it more than I do," she whispered to herself. Sophie turned on her heel and walked back into the diner, ordering a hot meal to go. She handed it to Henry with a gentle smile. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said softly. His watery eyes met hers, and for a moment, no words were necessary. Sophie felt a warmth in her chest, knowing she had done the right thing. That night, she went to bed hungry, but her heart was full. The following morning, Sophie arrived at Harper's Diner ready for another grueling day. She instinctively glanced at Henry's usual spot outside the diner, expecting to see his familiar figure. But it was empty. She frowned, scanning the street for any sign of him. The town was small, and Henry rarely strayed far. Perhaps he had found shelter for the night? The thought gave her a small measure of comfort, but worry still gnawed at her. As the day unfolded, Sophie tried to focus on her work, though her thoughts kept drifting back to Henry. The diner was unusually busy that morning, with the usual stream of regulars and a few unfamiliar faces. Among them was a sharply dressed man sitting at the corner booth. His tailored suit and leather briefcase stood out in the modest surroundings of Harper's Diner. Sophie noticed him scribbling notes in a small leather notebook as he nursed a cup of black coffee. Something about his demeanor struck her as unusual. He wasn't just passing through. He seemed to be observing, waiting. During her break, Sophie overheard snippets of conversation among her coworkers. "Did you hear? Some bigwig disappeared months ago. Billionaire or something," one of them whispered. "They say he just walked away from it all." Her mind immediately jumped to Henry. It was absurd, but could there be a connection? Shaking her head, Sophie dismissed the thought as her imagination running wild. The man in the suit returned the next day, and the day after that, his behavior consistent but enigmatic. On the third day, he finally approached Sophie at the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm looking for someone, and I think you might know him." Sophie blinked in surprise, setting down the coffee pot in her hand. "Looking for someone? Who?" The man introduced himself as Michael Hayes, a private investigator. "I'm searching for a man named William Preston," he said, sliding a photograph across the counter. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the face staring back at her. It was Henry. "Wait," she stammered, her mind reeling. "You're saying Henry? He's William Preston?" Michael nodded, his expression grave. William Preston, founder and former CEO of Preston Innovations. He disappeared 6 months ago after his wife passed away. He gave away most of his fortune to charity and vanished without a trace. Sophie felt as though the air had been knocked out of her. Henry, the quiet, unassuming man who sat outside her diner every day, was a billionaire? It didn't make sense. Why would someone with so much choose to live like that? Michael continued. "His daughter, Clara, has been searching for him ever since. She's desperate to find him and bring him home." Sophie's thoughts raced. She recalled the sadness in Henry's eyes, the weight he carried in his hunched shoulders. His grief must have been unbearable, pushing him to retreat from everything he had built. Michael leaned forward, his voice softening. Clara is hoping your kindness might have made an impact on him. He hasn't stayed anywhere long before, but something about this town, this diner, seems to have reached him. Do you have any idea where he might be now? Sophie shook her head, guilt and hope swirling in her chest. I don't know, she admitted, but if he's still nearby, I'll help you find him. Together, they began to piece together clues, Sophie determined to help reunite Henry, or William, with the family he had left behind. Her simple act of kindness had set something extraordinary in motion, though she had no idea just how far it would go. The next morning, Sophie arrived at Harper's Diner, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. She couldn't stop thinking about Henry, or William, and the life he had left behind. As she brewed the first pot of coffee for the day, the doorbell chimed. Turning around, she froze. Standing in the doorway was Henry, but he looked nothing like the man she had known. His face was clean-shaven, his graying hair neatly combed. He wore a sharp navy suit that fit him perfectly, a stark contrast to the threadbare coat he had always huddled in. Beside him stood a young woman, her auburn hair pulled back into an elegant ponytail. Her eyes, so strikingly similar to Henry's, scanned the room before landing on Sophie. Are you Sophie Carter? The woman asked, stepping forward. Her voice was calm but emotional, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. I am, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. The young woman smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. I'm Clara Preston. This is my father, William. Sophie's gaze shifted to Henry, no, William, who looked at her with a warmth she hadn't seen before. You saved me, he said softly. Saved you? Sophie asked, bewildered. Clara stepped in. My father has been lost for months. After my mother passed, he couldn't handle the grief. He gave everything away and disappeared. We've been searching for him ever since. He told me about you, about what you did for him. William spoke again, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. That night, you gave me a reason to believe in kindness again. I didn't think anyone cared anymore, but you changed that. Because of you, I found the strength to reach out to Clara. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. She had never imagined that a simple meal could have such an impact. Clara reached into her bag and handed Sophie an envelope. We want to thank you for your kindness. This is for you. Inside was a formal letter announcing the creation of the Sophie Carter Foundation for Community Care, with an initial donation of $5 million. Sophie's hands trembled as she read the words. William smiled. But that's not all. I've also purchased Harper's Diner. From now on, it's yours. You've given so much to others. This is our way of giving back to you. Sophie could hardly believe what had happened. One moment, she was a waitress struggling to make ends meet, and the next, she was the owner of Harper's Diner and the namesake of a multi-million-dollar foundation. In the weeks that followed, the diner underwent a transformation. William and Clara worked closely with Sophie to revamp the space, making it not just a restaurant, but a haven for those in need. A sign was placed by the entrance. No one goes hungry here. Sophie insisted on keeping the diner's charm intact, but the changes were undeniable. Extra tables were added to accommodate more guests, and a section of the menu was dedicated to free meals for those who couldn't afford to pay. Word spread quickly, and soon, the diner became a gathering place for people seeking comfort and hope. One chilly evening, an elderly woman entered the diner and sat at the counter. Sophie served her a warm cup of tea, noticing the gratitude in the woman's tired eyes. As they chatted, the woman shared a story that touched Sophie deeply. Years ago, the woman began, a stranger helped my son when he was at his lowest. That kindness gave him the strength to turn his life around. He's doing well now, and I'll never forget what that stranger did for us. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. The woman's words mirrored her own experience with William. It was a powerful reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion could ripple outward, changing lives in ways one might never imagine. As the diner flourished, Clara and William approached Sophie with a bold idea: to expand the Sophie Carter Foundation's reach beyond Willow Creek. They envisioned opening 3 more locations in nearby towns, each one following the diner's model of providing meals to anyone in need. Sophie hesitated at first, unsure if she could take on such a massive responsibility. But Clara reassured her. You've already proven what one act of kindness can do. Imagine how many more lives we could touch if we worked together. With Clara's encouragement and William's unwavering support, Sophie agreed. Plans for the new locations were set in motion, and Sophie was tasked with overseeing their development. The community rallied behind the initiative. Donations poured in, and volunteers came forward to help. One day, as Sophie was working behind the counter, a young man entered the diner. He looked nervous, his clothes worn and his hands tucked into his pockets. "I don't have any money," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "But I'm really hungry." Sophie smiled warmly. "You're in the right place. Sit anywhere you like." The young man hesitated, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. Sophie handed him a menu, assuring him that he could order whatever he wanted. As she watched him eat, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. William, seated at a nearby table, hence observed the interaction with pride. He leaned toward Clara and whispered, "This is exactly what I hoped for. Sophie has turned this into something extraordinary." The seeds of compassion Sophie had planted were now blossoming into a movement, one that would reach far beyond the walls of Harper's Diner. 3 months after the diner's transformation, the Sophie Carter Foundation had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined. The new locations were thriving, each one embracing the philosophy Sophie had instilled. No one should go hungry. Sophie's days were busier than ever. Between managing Harper's Diner and overseeing the operations of the new establishments, she found herself at the center of a rapidly expanding movement. Donations poured in from individuals, local businesses, and even national corporations, inspired by her story. Within a few months, the foundation's funds had grown to over $15 million. The City Council took notice of the foundation's impact. In a unanimous vote, they approved a proposal to open 6 additional locations in neighboring towns. The decision was celebrated as a victory for the community, and Sophie was invited to speak at a press conference announcing the expansion. Standing at the podium, Sophie felt a wave of emotion as she addressed the crowd. "When I first started working at Harper's Diner, I never imagined that something as simple as sharing a meal could lead to this. But what we've built together proves that kindness is powerful. It can transform lives, heal wounds, and create hope where there was none." Her speech resonated deeply, and the diner continued to draw attention from media outlets across the country. Journalists flocked to Willow Creek to capture the story of how one small act of compassion had sparked a nationwide movement. Sophie's work at the diner and the foundation had become more than a job. It was her life's mission. Every day, she encountered people whose lives had been touched by the foundation's efforts. One afternoon, a young girl named Emma approached Sophie at the counter, clutching a handmade card. Her shy smile lit up the room as she handed it over. "This is for you," Emma said softly. Sophie opened the card, her heart swelling as she read the message inside. "Thank you for helping my dad. Because of you, he found a job and a home for us." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as she knelt to hug Emma. "Your dad's strength brought him this far," she said gently. "We just gave him a little help along the way." The moments of gratitude Sophie experienced weren't limited to families like Emma's. An elderly man named George, who had been a regular at the diner for years, shared his own story one quiet evening. "My wife and I used to run a bakery before we lost everything," George confessed. "When I came here for the first time, I didn't know if I could face another day. But you made me feel human again. You reminded me that there's still good in the world." Sophie listened, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She realized that the diner wasn't just about providing food, it was about offering a second chance, a reminder of dignity and hope. William Preston, now a regular at Harper's Diner, often sat at the corner table with a cup of coffee, watching Sophie at work. Though he had built an empire in his previous life, he considered the diner's success his greatest achievement. "Sophie," he said one evening, as the diner began to wind down for the night, "you've done more here than I ever could have dreamed. This place is a beacon of hope." Sophie smiled warmly. "I couldn't have done it without you and Clara. You gave me the resources to turn an idea into reality." William shook his head. "No, you gave us the inspiration. Without your kindness, I might still be lost." The walls of the diner were now adorned with thank you notes from patrons, their heartfelt messages a testament to the impact Sophie's work had made. One particularly touching note read, "Because of this diner, my family and I survived the toughest winter of our lives. Thank you for not turning us away." As Sophie read the notes each evening, she was reminded of the power of compassion. What had started as a single act of kindness had grown into a movement that spanned multiple towns and touched countless lives. And yet, Sophie never let the scale of her success distract her from the heart of the mission. She continued to serve coffee, greet customers by name, and ensure that every person who walked through the diner's doors felt valued and welcome. William, sitting at his usual table, reflected on how much his life had changed since that cold night Sophie handed him a warm meal. He was no longer the broken man who had abandoned everything. He had found purpose again, thanks to her. The diner, once a simple establishment, had become a living testament to the idea that even the smallest gestures of kindness could create a legacy of giving. As the Sophie Carter Foundation continued to grow, Sophie found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From the quiet, humble days at Harper's Diner to overseeing a thriving network of community-focused establishments, the changes had been profound. Yet, through it all, she remained grounded by one simple truth. Kindness had the power to transform everything. The foundation had expanded to a staggering 10 locations, with more in the works. Each new diner was a beacon of hope for those struggling with hunger and homelessness. And each one was filled with stories of redemption and change. Sophie's role had evolved from waitress to visionary, but her core mission had remained the same: to ensure that no one who walked through the doors of her diners would ever feel alone, lost, or forgotten. One rainy afternoon, as she sat in her office, looking out over the bustling town square, Clara entered with a smile. "We're doing it," Clara said, her voice filled with excitement. "We've hit over $25 million in donations, and the city has just approved plans for 5 more locations. This isn't just a foundation anymore, Sophie. It's a movement." Sophie stood up, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. "It's amazing, isn't it? What a single act of kindness can do. But I can't help but think of the people who helped us get here. The volunteers, the community leaders, the patrons. This is their movement, too." Clara nodded. "It's true, but you started it. You made the first move, and look where it's brought us. You've changed more lives than you'll ever know." Sophie smiled, but there was a lingering feeling inside her, a desire to do more. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There's still so much work to be done. I want to ensure that no one, no matter where they are or who they are, ever has to feel like they're invisible again. We've proven what we can do, but we can do more." Clara's eyes sparkled with determination. "And we will. Together." Later that evening, as the diner filled with the familiar hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of coffee cups, Sophie's gaze lingered on a young couple sitting at a corner booth. Their baby, no older than 6 months, was bundled up in a tiny blanket. They looked tired but content, their hands clasped together in quiet solidarity. Sophie knew their story, how they had come to the diner a year ago, penniless and hungry, with no place to turn. Today, they were on their feet again, with stable jobs and a home. They were just one of many families whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. As the evening wore on, a man in his late 20s entered, his clothes worn but his posture proud. He walked up to Sophie, his eyes clear and focused. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I was homeless for years, but I found a job and a place to live after coming here. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. I'll never forget that." Sophie smiled, the familiar ache in her heart reminding her why she did this work. "It's not me who deserves the thanks," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's you. You did the hard work. We're just here to help you find the strength to keep going." As he nodded and turned to leave, Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was what it was all about, helping people find their footing, giving them the opportunity to reclaim their dignity. William had often said that he had built many things in his life, but none of it mattered as much as the diner. He had been right. Watching lives being rebuilt, communities coming together, and seeing hope where there was once despair. That was the true success. One evening, After the diner had closed and the last of the volunteers had left, Sophie sat alone at the counter, sipping a cup of coffee. She thought of all the people who had walked through those doors, all the lives that had intersected with hers. And she realized something profound. This diner, this foundation, was not just about food. It was about connection. It was about the threads that tied them all together, the invisible bond of compassion that could not be broken. Every meal served, every person welcomed, every story shared, it all mattered. And as she sat there watching the lights dim, Sophie knew that the future held limitless possibilities. The foundation would keep growing, the diners would keep serving, and the message of kindness would keep spreading. She was just one person, but she had become part of something much bigger than herself. A legacy of giving, a movement rooted in the belief that even the smallest act of kindness could change the world. With that thought in her heart, Sophie smiled. There was still so much to do, so many more lives to touch. But one thing was certain: kindness would always have a home here. As Sophie Carter stood at the counter of Harper's Diner, the warm glow of the evening lights casting a soft halo around her, she couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary journey she had undertaken. What had started as one small act of kindness had turned into something far greater than she had ever imagined. Something that was changing lives, one meal at a time. The foundation was no longer just an idea or a dream. It was a powerful force for good, a movement that spread across towns, cities, and hearts. Sophie had given so much of herself to this cause, and yet it felt like the more she gave, the more she received in return. Every thank you note, every story of hope, every person whose life had been transformed was a reminder that kindness could indeed change the world. Looking around the diner, with its bustling atmosphere and faces full of gratitude, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace. This was the home she had built, a place where no one was turned away, where every person was treated with dignity and compassion, no matter their past or present. The diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a sanctuary, a reminder of the power of human connection, and a beacon of hope for anyone in need. As she gazed out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sophie knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, and there would be challenges along the way. But she was ready. With every step, every decision, and every gesture of kindness, she would continue to build a future where no one would ever have to face their struggles alone. Sophie smiled to herself, the weight of her journey lifting with every passing moment. She had found her purpose, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would live on far beyond the walls of Harper's Diner. After all, kindness was a gift that never stopped giving, and she was only just getting started. And so, the story of Sophie Carter, the woman who had changed the world one meal at a time, would continue to inspire, teach, and remind everyone that sometimes the smallest actions can create the biggest ripples. Thank you so much for staying with us and experiencing this incredible journey of kindness and transformation. Your support means the world to us, and we're so glad you followed Sophie's story from start to finish. If you enjoyed this tale and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your engagement helps us continue sharing stories that inspire and uplift. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what part of the story touched you the most. And if you think someone else would benefit from this story, feel free to share it. Once again, thank you for being a part of this journey. We look forward to bringing you even more heartwarming content. Stay kind, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next video.